right, just to recap for you, we concluded our discussion of skeletal muscles yesterday. We moved into smooth muscles, and we used our handout number 5 to better understand them, and then looked at some fairly current research articles to better understand them. And we're going to finish up our discussion of our smooth muscle. We're going to reiterate the difference between a single unit versus a multi-unit. And then we're going to add in there the neural control over our smooth muscles. From then, we're going to briefly conclude in this chapter cardiac muscle, but we'll kind of repeat the information when we get into chapter 13. To remind you, in your reading pages in your textbook, chapter 13, we're not going to cover everything in there for this unit, so make sure you go to those reading pages outlined in your syllabus. We concluded yesterday, or discussed yesterday, the difference between single unit and multi-unit smooth muscle, so we'll repeat this information to help fill in your guided notes. Visually speaking, we have both types of tissues represented on this image. Although we can see the label, if we looked at the details, we can tell what type of smooth muscles are these in the top panel. Do what? No, smooth muscles. Single unit, right? Okay. How'd you know they were single unit besides the label? The gap junctions are going to be the giveaway. Okay. And then if we contrast that to the panel of images on the bottom, we can still see those are smooth muscles, but they aren't connected by gap junctions, so they function as multi-unit smooth muscles. As well, we learned that either type of tissue is under the control of the autonomic nervous system, but we learned one type is more dependent upon the autonomic nervous system. Which one is most dependent upon the autonomic nervous system? It's 50-50 as multi-unit smooth muscle. Why is multi-unit smooth muscle more dependent on the autonomic nervous system?
They don't have the pacemaker cells.
Very good, because they don't have the pacemaker cells. Contrasting to the single unit cells have intrinsic control. They also respond to extrinsic autonomic control, but the multi-unit rely exclusively on the extrinsic control. Okay. As well, we're going to add something to you'll notice that the nerves look pretty differently controlling our smooth muscles, and we'll describe these things called varicoses in just a moment. But it's these areas in which neurotransmitters actually released. Typical nerve structure looks a little bit differently. We also, if we look at the single unit, sometimes you can call it what's called visceral smooth muscle, meaning you'll find it lining your internal visceral organs like the digestive system, for example. We learned that the cells are self-excitable, and that all of the cells in the single unit are physically connected and functionally connected by those gap junctions. We also concluded in the image in our discussion yesterday, the point of that is to transmit action potentials, to flow from one cell to another. The result is not just a single cell contraction, but just a huge, massive contraction of all the cells. And so that, if you remember, we learned that smooth muscle contracts slowly, but it's in this kind of coordinated pattern, right? When they're all just kind of this really neat-looking, continuous type of contraction. Because all of the cells, say in the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, whatever, are all physically connected, they collectively could be called a functional syncytium. And basically they work together as a single unit. They're all, although they're individual cells, they're collectively working together as like they were one, as a single unit. We'll use that word functional syncytium to describe another organ. What other organ do you think we could use to describe a functional syncytium that acts as a single unit? The heart. Because it also has pacemaker cells that are also connected by gap junctions. And figure 12.35 in your textbook again just reiterates, and those are representing the gap junctions, kind of poorly, but you can kind of see them. And then as well, the neural control over those cells. If we contrast your single unit to your multi-unit smooth muscle cells, you'll find these in areas of the body that do not need to be coordinated in their response. Okay, so for example, lining the respiratory system. They're not all like a big rack surrounding around the respiratory system, but a bunch of individual muscle cells can surround the main stem bronchi to regulate airflow into each lung. Also, in the erector pili muscles attached to your hair follicles, what do you think these are used for? For what? This is when your hair stands up, okay? So when you're like scared or alert or cold or whatever, okay, so that autonomic response that you get when your hair stands up is controlled by these multi-unit smooth muscles. Okay? And some muscles inside of your eye, we don't need the whole eye like contracting all at the same time. So there's some very precise control over those muscles in there. So if we contrast multi-unit to single unit smooth muscle, the multi-unit most likely does not have any gap junctions. They don't have a pacemaker, so they're not going to randomly depolarize. And they have what's considered to be graded contractions in response to neural stimulus. And so when the autonomic nervous system activates them, we can have a range of tension generated by them, from a moderate to a really tense type of force generated by that muscle group. But certainly the autonomic nervous system controls them, and we can still use the same type of terminology about motor units here as well. Okay. One nerve cell controlling multiple individual muscle fibers. Does that make some recollection to lab? I mentioned a moment ago the structure called the varicosity. I pointed out in the images. And instead of having a single little axon terminal synapsing at each of these tiny little smooth muscle cells, a given nerve cell can release its neurotransmitter along its axon. And along the axon, the neurotransmitter collects not just at the end, but these regions called varicosities, those little bulbs that we saw in the previous image, and so neurotransmitters released around the way. It's described as a diffuse junction versus calling it a synapse. So there's kind of leaking, if you will, neurotransmitter all over a large surface to control a lot of individual muscle cells simultaneous. Does that picture kind of help with that description? Let me back up to it. These little varicosity. We can see the neurotransmitter containing vesicles, and so when this one nerve gets excited, it can control all of these muscle cells simultaneous. And here's just an alternative image as well, looking at the varicosities. And lots of general control. So this wouldn't be as specific as, say, controlling the skeletal muscles in your leg or whatever, right? But we're controlling a large surface area of individual smooth muscle cells. That actually is going to conclude our discussion of smooth muscles. Before I move on to our cardiac muscle introduction, I'd like to see if you have any questions about smooth muscles or even skeletal muscles if you thought of something over the evening before we look at some characteristics of our cardiac muscle. Huge structural differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle, as well regulation. And the assembly of the thin and thick filaments are big time different between the different cell types. What questions do you have about the control, structure, etc., between a skeletal versus a smooth muscle? Okay. All right, we're going to briefly summarize cardiac muscle. I wanted to separately talk about smooth versus skeletal because we have those big differences. And then we contrast it to cardiac. We're going to see properties similar to skeletal and properties similar to smooth muscle. So it's going to be a mixture of the two. First thing is cardiac muscle is what? What can we see here? It's definitely striated, hands down. Okay, so we can see that's going to be very similar to our skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is localized strictly to the heart and in normal conditions unless you're in the middle of a heart attack, right? And then it's broken down and in the blood. But it makes up the structure of the heart. We learned it's striated. We also know that it's dually innervated by the autonomic nervous system. So it's under involuntary control. It also has a pacemaker. You probably heard that word outside of class yesterday. And it allows us to, it can control itself intrinsically. It can also be what? Intrinsically controlled by the pacemaker? Very good. Extrinsically controlled by the para and sympathetic nervous system, as described by just simply saying involuntary. If we look at the structure of the contractile units, our cardiac thin filaments do have troponin and tropomyosin, just like what? Just like skeletal muscle. Okay, so it's built like skeletal muscle, therefore it gets activated just like skeletal muscle. So calcium has to bind to troponin of each. What type of muscles? Each. What muscle are we in now? Cardiac, and also in skeletal muscle, but not in smooth muscle. But is calcium necessary in smooth muscle? Yes, but in a different mechanism. Okay. It initiates that second messenger pathway. Calcium is obviously still important, but if we look at its primary source, calcium for the skeletal muscle predominantly comes from where? Extracellular fluid, much like which cell type? Smooth muscle. Okay. That influx of calcium can release the sarcoplasmic reticulum of stored calcium, but the initial flux comes from the extracellular fluid. We also note that our cells of the heart are connected by gap junctions, which makes it a functional syncytium. Table 12.2 will summarize the differences between your skeletal, different types of smooth muscle, and your cardiac muscle. So it'd be a good kind of table to refer, maybe quiz yourself, and summarize chapter 12 for us. With that, I'm going to transition to chapter 13, which is dealing with the cardiovascular system, and more specifically, we're going to look at just the heart.